All right, let's get started. Okay, I'm putting the sources in the chat as always. If you're watching this or listening to this at some point in the future and you would like the sources, you can email me at deborahklapper@gmail.com. I'm also going to share my screen so we can go through them together. And okay, so we are finally, after well, I guess this is part 10. After many shiurim in the 10th chapter of Pesachim, we are finally getting to material directly about the Seder. And we begin by returning to the language of the Mishnah that we had 10 weeks ago, which said that everybody has to recline at the Seder, even poor people. And as a word of introduction, before we start, I have to note that the rules about reclining seem to assume that there is no space between nobility, that is to say slave owning, and slavery, and those are the only two options, and the only way to show that you are not a slave is by acting like a noble. There seems to be that seems to be hovering in the background. I would like to believe that there is a possibility for society without any slaves at all, but maybe that's delusional and we just have different words now that we use for the same kinds of behaviors. I don't know. In any case, you might have thought that poor people, because they don't normally reclining is normally a behavior reserved for the wealthy and powerful, you might have thought that they don't have to recline on Pesach, but the Mishnah says that no, even the poorest person should not eat until they recline. Okay, so that with that bit of the Mishnah as the introduction, the Gemara becomes interested in what is it that you're not supposed to eat unless you recline. So, Itmar. Matzah tzarich heseba, maror in tzarich heseba. So the Gemara says that you need to recline to eat matzah. You don't need to recline to eat maror, and it would seem that the symbolism here is that maror represents the life before the Exodus, and matzah represents life after the Exodus, and you act like a free man while you're being free, and there's no reason to pretend to be a free man while you're reliving the Exodus. It could be pointed out that on at least one occasion during the Seder, we eat matzah and maror together. The Gemara does not deal with the question of in what position you should eat korech, although it certainly seems to suggest itself here. Okay, that leaves open wine though. Yain, itmar mishmei Rav Nachman, tzarich heseba, the itmar mishmei Rav Nachman, ein tzarich heseba. So as for wine, we have two different quotes in the name of the same Rav Nachman. The first one is that wine requires reclining, and the other one is that wine does not require reclining. Now, that might sound like a problem, but the Gemara says, lo pligi, there's no disagreement here between these two different versions of Rav Nachman. Ha betarte kase kamai, one of them is about the first two cups. Ha betarte kase batrai, and one of them is about the last two cups. Now, you may ask which two are which, and the Gemara asks exactly that. Except it turns out not to be determinable, more or less. Amri la gisa, tre kasi kamai bau heseba. Sorry, Amri la gisa of Amri la gisa. That's what happens when you have lines that are almost the same. So they said it this way, and they also said it that way. Amri la gisa. They said it the first way. Trei kase kamae bau haseba. The first 2 cups do require reclining. Dahashtahu ka matchala lacherut, because this is when the freedom is taking place. So this is when you need to act free, is right at the beginning when you're saying, I used to be a slave, but I'm not a slave anymore. That's the moment for reclining. Trei kase batrai lo ba heseba, maida hava hava. The last 2 cups, on the other hand, are kind of an anticlimax. They don't require reclining because it happened already. Moving on. Okay, that's the first suggestion for what maybe Rav Nachman meant. Second suggestion is va'amri la lahaigis, and they also said it this way: adarabba, to the contrary. Trei kase batrai ba'u haseba. The last 2 cups, those are the ones that require reclining. Hayishata de kahavya cherut. By then we were already free, and it's when you're free that you want to recline. Trei kase kamai lo bai haseba. But the first 2 cups don't require reclining, because then you're going to say, I was a slave. And that's kind of like eating maror. You're reliving the experience of being a slave. So that's not the moment for acting like a free person. So the Gemara kind of gives up. Now that it said it this way, and it also said it that way, so now they both require reclining because we simply don't know which way to do it. The first 2, last 2, we don't know which 2, so we're going to recline for all 4. Okay, now we get to the question of what actually constitutes reclining.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that why did they go with, okay, we're not sure what to do, so we're going to recline for all 4, as opposed to going with, we're not sure what to do, so we're not going to recline for any of them? Because isn't it as problematic to not recline when you're supposed to be? Like, why isn't it the problem the other way?
With the possible exception of the maror, and I'm not even sure that there's really a problem there, I think the Gemara is working with the assumption that if you were to sit at the Seder reclined on a couch like a noble person eating dinner and just eat the entire Seder that way, that would be fine. The question is not so much whether that's okay as whether this poor person who doesn't have the right furniture for it and doesn't normally recline, they're kind of like us, actually, like the sham reclining of leaning to your side while sitting in an upright chair, how much of that are we going to impose on him? And it doesn't seem to bother us that much to make him do it 2 extra times.
Got it.
And it should in fact be noted that we don't have the right furniture for this. We're not, you need one of the sort of a sideways chaise longue kind of deal with a table that's at exactly the right height to be in front of you while you're reclining. You also presumably get better at eating without spilling food in that position, although I have not accomplished that. I guess, like all other table manners, it takes practice. But I don't think, except maybe the maror, I don't think there's a part of the Seder where it would be problematic to eat it as like a noble person.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay. But so now, as to what's reclining, they say prakdan lo shmei haseba. Prakdan seems to be lying on your back. That's not reclining. I would have said it's also not safe to eat in that position. That's certainly what I said to my children when they tried to eat in that position, lying on the floor, well, not cooperating with me as small kids. But the Gemara does not seem concerned about that. I'm not entirely sure why. Because they do go to that now with the reclining on the right thing. Haseba yamin lo shmei haseba, leaning to the right, is also not called leaning. V'lo od ela shema yakdim kana leveshet v'yavo lidei sakana. And furthermore, if you're leaning to the right, they're concerned that the food will find your trachea before it finds your esophagus, and you'll inhale the food instead of swallowing it. and that will be dangerous. I don't actually know the anatomy well enough to know whether that's a real thing, but the Gemara certainly believes it to be a real thing.
Deborah?
Yeah.
Deborah? This is Andrew Yablon. My understanding is there is a physiological basis to recline on the left because, the esophagus enters your stomach on the right side.
Okay.
And I don't think that's what they're talking about in the Gemara, but I think it may be that in Roman times, it might have been accustomed to recline to the left or whatever, empirically, because, if you have like reflux or whatever, lying on the left side is more comfortable than on the right side.
So I guess I have two questions about that. One of them is, aren't there a certain number of people whose organs are mirror image? At least
There
some
is
of them,
that.
if not all of them.
There is that.
It's
I think
very
it's quite
rare.
rare.
It's not
Okay.
like left-handedness.
I'm with Andrew. I was under the impression it was somewhat less common than left-handedness, but okay. My other question is, it feels to me like, now that we've mentioned handedness, that the ability to eat with your right hand seems like it should be coming into this conversation. And I've always been a little mystified by the fact that it doesn't. And
Actually thinking that same thing, that if you're reclining on your right side, you can't really feed yourself if you're right-handed, which the majority of the population is or was.
right. Well, I think you probably could, assuming you have a left hand, feed yourself or learn to feed yourself in the same way as left-handed people who are abused into not using their left hands do eventually learn how to eat and how to write and so on. They're just very uncomfortable. So I imagine one could feed oneself. One would just not be as comfortable. I don't know. I think I feel like there is more to the whole situation here that I'm not being fully understanding, and I am personally somewhat mystified by the idea that you're more likely to choke leaning to the right than lying flat on your back. That one just doesn't compute in my brain.
Also, this is Harvey. Is this saying, is the point of this that you should only lean when you're drinking the kos and not when you're eating? Because I do remember Haggadot saying that you should, when you drink, you lean to the right. And I don't know if that's just, because of who wrote these things, that they always lean to the right, but
so instructions to lean specifically to the right feel to me like a mistake. I think it should say lean to the left, but I don't know. I'd have to see it.
I won't know for 2 weeks.
Yes, all of my stuff is in boxes in the basement, and I will find out whether any of it still exists soon. But the other thing is, as I was saying before, I think this is a minimal standard. If you would actually recline on a old-fashioned dining couch to eat the whole meal, I don't think that would be problematic. It's just not necessary. I think we can be pretty sure that all of the rabbis who, for the last 10 pages of Gemara, have been repeatedly described on Friday afternoon as reclining at their formal meals that they are mysteriously eating at 3:00 in the afternoon on a weekday when they're supposed to be preparing for Shabbat. I'm pretty sure those guys are also reclining at the Shulchan Aruch part of their Seder. At least it seems reasonable to me that they would be. Okay, so now we move on to a little bit of who, because we said even the poorest person, but that didn't deal with social hierarchy inside the household, which we are now getting to. So the Gemara says, Isha etzel ba'ala lo bai haseba, a married woman, a woman with her husband, I suppose it's a married woman who is with her husband, does not need to recline. But v'im isha chashuva hi tzricha hasiba. But if she's an important woman, she needs to recline. And this seems to be an indication that there was some level of social stratum above which women did recline and below which the men reclined, but the women didn't. And it seems like if you were the sort of woman who reclined normally, then you should recline at the Seder also, and otherwise you were exempt, even though the men at that level did need to. And in fact, men who didn't normally recline also needed to recline. It's worth mentioning that there are several different Tosafists who respond to this statement with more or less, well, all of our women are important. Although the Rav Moshe Isserlis, the Ramah, who records these positions in his gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, says that, all of our women are important, but there's another Tosafist, the Ra'avya, who says, but we don't recline anymore anyway, because this is not our normal social custom. And so the Ramah says, but in my time, the men rule that we do still recline, and the women rule that we don't recline anymore. They're holding by different legal positions, but all of our women are important. And if we did need to recline, they would need to recline. As far as I can tell, the very widespread practice now of men and women both reclining is probably related to people looking at that and saying, well, that's pretty silly. The whole community has to either believe that we recline in the 21st century or believe that we don't recline in the 21st century. We don't normally have men and women holding by totally different legal positions in the same household. That would be odd. And so my impression of the state of the situation right now is that for the most part, it's not a gendered behavior.
What about, in Haredi families where they would normally eat separately?
I have to say that the only Haredi families I'm personally acquainted with are the ones I'm related to, and they all have family meals as a family group. They may separate for big social occasions when they're at a bar mitzvah or a wedding or something like that, but for a Shabbat or Yom Tov meal with their family, even if they're staying at a hotel, a Shabbat or Yom Tov meal with their family is going to be the family around a table. So what you describe may exist, but I haven't personally seen it, so I don't know anything about it. And I'm not sure it would change the reclining thing. Okay, so let's go to a couple of other forms of social stratification, I guess. Ben etzel aviv by heseba. A son with his father does need to recline. That may be a little bit of our being countercultural against the prevailing norms. My impression is that in the Roman Empire, men didn't really attain adulthood until their fathers died. And that in general, the Gemara pushes back against that. So then they want to know, Ibayaluhu, Talmid etzel Rabbo Mai. Okay, fine. So you recline in the presence of your father, but you recline in the presence of your teacher? Tashma. Damar Abaye, Ki Havina and Beimar. Abaye says, when we used to be at my teacher's house, Zaginan Abarche de Hadade. We would recline on each other's knees, which sounds a lot like they have a little bit of a crowding problem and a shortage of furniture, but they're all reclining. They're doing their best on the floor here. It sounds sort of like. Ki Atenan Leve Rav Yosef, but when we came to the house of Rav Yosef, who is also one of Abaye's teachers, but not his only one, Amar Lan, he told us, Lo tzrichitu mora rabcha k'mar shamayim. He told us, you don't need to recline because the fear of your teacher is like the fear of heaven. It's not entirely clear why being afraid of your teacher, or for that matter, being afraid of heaven, should stop you from reclining, but it might put you into a permanent state of submissiveness or servitude to the point where you're actually not really capable of experiencing freedom, and there might just be no point. It might also just be rude to act assertive in front of someone you're supposed to be submissive in front of. It's not entirely clear to me why that should be the case. Okay, so we suggested tiyuvta against this. Meitive, imakol adam mesev vafilu talmid etzel rabbo. Everybody should recline in front of everybody, even students in front of teachers. But the Gemara says, now that's not really a tiyufta, because kitanya hahi, when it taught that, that's talking about bishvelia denagare. That's talking about an apprentice with a carpenter. So that's a different kind of teacher-student relationship. Also, certainly one that involves submission, but not religiously important submission. So we're prepared to tell the carpenter, swallow your pride and let the kid recline, which we might not be interested in removing Torah hierarchy. Okay, so we seem to be leaving it that if you're in front of your Torah teacher, there's at least ambiguity, and possibly we follow Rav Yosef and you don't recline. So Ibayalu, they asked, Shamash Mai. Okay, what about the waiter? The waiter is actually present at this meal as a servant. And it would be unusual to invite him to sit down with you. Inviting him to recline seems way over the top. But so we need to resolve what the situation is here. So Tashma, the Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Hashamash achal kazayit matzah kishehu mesev yatsa. So Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, if a waiter ate an olive's worth of matzah while reclining, he fulfilled his obligation. So that sounds like we actually have during the Seder, we have people who are serving at the table who are also trying to fulfill their obligations in between courses or something. But it doesn't sound like they're family members who you wait for and who you're, concerned about, and everybody jumps up to help. It sounds like these are employees who are, there to make sure that the people who are reclining at the Seder don't have to stand up and help. In any case, our interpretation of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is mesiv in lo mesiv lo. So if he was reclining, he fulfilled his obligation. Sounds like if he didn't recline, he didn't fulfill his obligation. So it sounds like the waiter is obligated to recline, even while he's being a waiter. So shma mina by heseba shma mina. Indeed, we conclude that he does need to recline. The Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. So as long as we're quoting Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi's statements about the Seder, let's quote another one. Nashim chayavot b'arba kosod halalu she'afhin hayu bo tohanes. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says women are obligated in these 4 cups because they were also in the miracle. Now, it's tempting to translate that as women were rescued. Right? They were among the people who had been enslaved and who are no longer enslaved and got out of Egypt in the Exodus. But there seems to be a consensus among the interpreters that that's not correct, and that they were also in the miracle is, like I translated it in the English here, that they were the cause of the miracle. And the same thing happens with the same phrase that's used when it's used about Hanukkah, that all of the interpretations are about how women participated in the bravery of the rebellion against the Greeks. And the same thing ends up happening when the same language is used about Purim, that all of the interpretation is all about Esther. So it would seem that when you have miracles that the women are instrumental in causing, the women end up equally obligated, which might explain why we don't say the same thing about Sukkot, because the women live in the desert for 40 years right next to the men. So if it were just about being rescued by the miracle, then presumably women would also be obligated in Sukkah, but because that miracle doesn't seem to be attached to any particular action by anybody, male or female, so I think that's what's motivating this interpretation. In any case, the women are involved in the miracle in a number of ways, beginning with the midwives, continuing through Miriam and Yocheved rescuing Moshe, the midrashim about the righteous women who kept the Jewish people going when the men had already given up, in a number of different ways, including insisting on continuing to have more children. So women are obligated in the 4 cups. And Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Arba kosot halalu tzarich sheyehe behen kedei mezigat kos yafeh. So now we're moving on to, okay, but what's a cup? So the way that the Gemara assumes people consume wine, at least responsible, decent, civilized people, is diluted 3-to-1 with water. All right, so you take 2 ounces of water, put it in a cup, add 2 ounces of wine, put it in a cup, add 6 ounces of water. That's what we mean when we say wine in the Gemara. And for many years, people assumed that that was because the wine was unusually strong. It is my understanding that we now actually have archaeological evidence that that's not true, and the wine was about the same strength as ours. It's just a cultural thing. Be that as it may,
Well, remember in those days, there weren't any, really didn't have a large variety of soft drinks.
Well,
so
that's true.
If you drank wine all the time straight, all day.
Well, that's true, but it's also the case, as far as I understand it, that they're drinking beer straight, which is certainly way more alcoholic than the heavily diluted wine. But also the situation you described continues until a couple hundred years ago. And my impression of the Middle Ages is that people were drinking their wine straight already by then. So I don't think that's the only motivating factor. There's a culture to how people drink and what people mix their drinks with, and people mix their drinks with things that are a lot stranger than water. So I think it's at least part of it is cultural. In any case, Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said that these 4 cups should have enough wine in them to mix a nice cup. And a nice cup seems to be defined, as we will see going on, as a revit of liquid, which is a quarter wine. A revit, by the way, is it can be defined, depending on who you ask, as somewhere between just under 3 ounces and about 4 ounces. But whatever it is, it's not as big as like our wine glasses. I think even by the like unusually large measurements of the Chazon Ish. Okay. The Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel continues though, Shata'an chai, if you drank it, what he describes as raw, but usually we translate that as undiluted, yatsa, you fulfilled the obligation. Shata'an bevat achat, yatsa, if you drank them all at once, which Rashi says means you poured it into 4 cups so that you'd have 4 cups, but then you dumped the 4 cups into one bigger cup and drank the whole thing. Apparently you fulfilled the obligation that way too. Hishka mehen lebanav livnei beito yatsa, and also if you shared the liquid in your cup with your children and your household members, that works also. But now we're going to go through each of these things and discuss them, at least a little bit. Shata'an chai yatsa, if he drank them unmixed, that works. Ooh, sorry. That English should say if he drank them unmixed, he fulfills his obligation. It's a mistake. Amar Rava yedei yain yatsa, yedei chirut lo yatsa. Rava says he fulfills the obligation of wine, but he doesn't fulfill his obligation of freedom. And it's not entirely clear what that means. It's not entirely clear what obligation one has of freedom, but it would seem that Rava thinks there's some kind of obligation, maybe actually a legal obligation, maybe more of a nebulous moral thing, to act like a free person, and free people don't act like barbarians, and you're acting like a barbarian, so you didn't quite get the message. Seems to be the message from Rava here. We don't seem terribly concerned about that. We absolutely drink our wine completely undiluted. Although my family did have a family friend who drank his wine with ice cubes in it, so that it would taste like wine, so it would be undiluted to fit with our cultural understanding of what wine is, but it would also have enough water in it to not be barbaric, according to the Gemara. It's an interesting attempt at compromise.
If you look at the label of Kedem Light grape juice, it's specifically, the water is mixed to make sure that there's still enough grape juice in there, so it's good for the Seder.
Yeah, so the irony is that we've now decided that the way our culture drinks wine, the wine has to be almost completely undiluted in order to be valid for the Seder. And that the culture shifted in the last 1,500 years. Things are just different now. We've also decided to use totally non-alcoholic wine, which is my understanding is that the phenomenon of adults using grape juice is from the 20th century and dates to prohibition in this country. But
and
I'm
also
not an expert
the
on
advent
that.
of medications that don't mix with alcohol.
Yeah, although I think we've always had people that doctors told not to drink alcohol. And they may have drunk grape juice or they may not have, I don't know, but we have very widespread use, at least on Shabbat for Kiddush, and I think also at the Seder, of adults who just drink grape juice because they don't want to be drunk. My impression is that that's a 20th century American thing. It didn't so much exist before that. It also has to be said that before preservatives, grape juice was a product that could only be consumed fresh. It wasn't stable. If you wanted your grape juice to keep, you had to ferment it into wine, or it spoiled. So that could also be a reason why it doesn't become a big thing till the 20th century. Okay, so moving along, shata'an bevat achat. If he drank them all at once, then Rav Amar, Yedei Yayin Yatsa, Yedei Bakosot Lo Yatsa. Rav said, well, you fulfilled your obligation to drink wine, but I don't see 4 cups here. That one actually seems sort of self-explanatory. Okay, Hishka Mehen Levanav Livnei Veto, if he fed them to his family, Amar of Nachman Bar Yitzchak, V'hu De'ishti Ruba Dekasa. Nachman Bar Yitzchak says the only way it could be true that you fulfill your obligation while also sharing the wine is if you drank most of the cup and you just shared a minority of it with other people. Okay, but now we're gonna challenge the main part of that statement, which was the part about needing enough to mix a nice cup. Meitive. Arba kosot halalu, tzarich sheyehe bahen k'dei revi'it, echad chai ve'echad mazug, echad chadash ve'echad yashan. Rabbi Yehuda omer tzarich sheyehe bo tam u'marei yain. So here's the Braita that we're suggesting as a tifta. These 4 cups need to contain a revi'it, whether they're undiluted or they're diluted, whether it's new wine or old wine. And Rabbi Yehuda says it has to taste and look like wine. Okay, that the problem here seems to be that Katani Mihat Kedei Revi'it Ve'at Amart Kos Yafeh. The problem seems to be that this says you need to have a revi'it, whether it's mixed or unmixed, you need to end up with a revi'it. And the earlier statement said you needed enough to mix a nice cup. That the one sounds like you need a revit of wine, and the other one sounds like you need a quarter of a revit of wine. Okay. Amri idi ve'idi chad shiurahu. But they say, no, they're really all talking about the same thing. And my kidei mizigat kos yafed kamar, what is enough to mix a nice cup? That's lekol chad v'chad. For each of the 4 cups, you need enough to mix a nice cup. That is to say, a quarter of a revit. Dehavi lahu kulhu revit. And then the total for each person at the whole meal, you're going to need 1 revit per person. You're going to dilute it 3 to 1 with water. That's going to give you 4 nice cups per person of diluted wine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Tzarich sheyehebo tamu mar'eh. Rabbi Yehuda says it has to taste and look like wine. This is a reference to our preference for red wine. Amar Rava, my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. So Rava says, what's Rabbi Yehuda's reason? Dichtiv al tevre yayin ki tadam. There's a verse in Mishlei that says, don't look at wine when it's red. It seems to be assuming that wine is red, or at least that the appearance of wine is for it to be red. And so Rabbi Yehuda is just borrowing that. And he's saying, if it's wine, it's red. It's not red, it's not wine. Okay. Tana Rabbanan. HaKol chayavim b'arba kosot halalu echad anashim v'echad nashim v'echad tinokot. Now here's a strange assertion. The Braita says everybody's obligated in the 4 cups, men, women, and children. And Rabbi Yehuda says exactly what you would think Rabbi Yehuda would say, which is v'chima to'elet yesh l'tinokot b'yayin. Rabbi Yehuda says, what's the point of giving wine to children? They don't like it. It ruins their evening if you try to make them drink it, and it's going to put them to sleep, which is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to do. And they don't really understand an association between wine and freedom anyway, so that doesn't make any sense. So instead, Rabbi Yehuda says, "Ela mechalkin lahem klayot ve'egozim be'erev Pesach, kedei shelo yishlu v'yishalu." This is instead we distribute to them roasted grain and nuts on Erev Pesach, and it sounds like he means also during the Seder, although he doesn't specifically say that, so that they will stay awake and they'll ask questions. It sounds like one of the questions they're going to ask is, Mommy, why are you letting me have roasted grain and nuts instead of dinner?
How can you have roasted grain on Pesach?
So here's the thing. We live in a world that has passed through the early Middle Ages, in which, at least in the Ashkenazi community, we basically completely stopped processing grain in any way at all on Pesach because of the concern that you might manufacture chametz by mistake and end up owning chametz. We don't bake matzah on Pesach anymore, and we also don't eat grain in any form that's not matzah, because in order to do so, you'd have to have grain that was not yet cooked and then do something with it on Pesach, which could potentially produce chametz.
We don't eat anything that even remotely looks like grain.
Correct, although that is an even later development. The Gemara assumes, in fact, that you can use any method of cooking on grain at all, as long as either, like this roasting, it doesn't involve getting it wet, or you're completely finished cooking it within 18 minutes of when you start cooking, when you get it wet. They're totally fine with you eating fresh porridge on Pesach too, as long as you cooked it really fast. That is, in fact, the Gemara's instruction for how to make chicken feed on Pesach, because they used to soak I think it's bran in cold water before feeding it to the chickens. That's definitely chametz. So they suggest that on Pesach you put the bran into boiling water instead and feed that to the chickens.
So wait, Deborah, if I understand you correctly, it means I can actually have wheatina on Pesach.
Almost certainly not, because the wheatina is almost certainly processed in such a way that it got wet months ago.
Oh, okay.
If you had raw, unprocessed grain that you were sure had never gotten wet since it was harvested, and you processed it yourself, and the first time it got wet, within 18 minutes it was fully cooked, then yes, the Gemara would think that was okay. The practice in the Ashkenazi community for, I think, close to 1,000 years has been to consider that to be playing with fire, because if you don't do it quite right, you're going to end up with chametz instead. But the Gemara certainly assumes that we're baking fresh matzah every day. This idea of eating matzah that was baked in November and tastes like cardboard is definitely foreign to the Gemara. So, again, cultural practices change over time, and what the reduction in quality of food that you're willing to tolerate in order to avoid risk changes over time. But the answer, Andrew, is that in the Gemara, they would certainly have been willing to manufacture their own wheatina on Pesach, but the wheatina that you buy in the grocery store now is almost certainly totally chametz before you purchase it. Because as I understand it, most grain in this country, in order to reduce the risk of fire, because flour is very flammable when it's in the air, has water sprinkled on it during transport.
That's regrettable. That's regrettable.
That's what?
Regrettable.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Also, if you're considering making homemade matzah, which is another thing I don't have the risk tolerance for that, but if you do, you definitely need to buy Pesach specific flour for that. You cannot use ordinary flour because it's definitely not Pesach thick. Okay. But I think the point here seems to be that we're giving the kids snacks that we wouldn't normally let them eat at this time of day or in this way. And A, eating keeps you awake, as anyone who's ever gained weight while a freshman in college knows. And B, the kids will be confused by having the rules be changed, and they'll ask why. And like everything else that's designed at the Seder to make people ask, that's just another step. Okay, so Amru alav al Rabbi Akiva. They said about Rabbi Akiva, Shaya mechalek klayot ve'egozim l'tzinokot b'erev Pesach. He used to give out roasted grain and nuts to children on Erev Pesach. Kedei shelo yishnu v'yishalu. Same as what Rabbi Yehuda did in the last line. Just this is Rabbi Akiva. Okay, another Braita. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer chotvin matzot b'leilei Pesachim b'shvil tinokot shelo yishnu. Rabbi Eliezer says we something our matzah on the night of Pesach for the children so that they don't fall asleep. There's a dispute whether that means we gobble the matzah quickly, or we hold up the matzah in the Seder plate. Rashi, or maybe it's Rashbam, prefers the eating the matzah quickly explanation. But whatever it is, it's a violation of normal table etiquette. Again, for the purpose of getting the kids to say, wait a minute, you don't normally let me do that. Why are you doing it that way? Tanya, Amru alav al Rabbi Akiva, mi'amav lo amar higia et lamod b'veit midrash chutz me'arvei Pesachim ve'erev Yom Kippur. They said about Rabbi Akiva that he never used to say, okay, it's time for everybody to stand up and get out of here in the Beit Midrash, except on Erev Pesach and on Erev Yom Kippur, when he in fact did shoo everyone out of the Beit Midrash. The Erev Pesach, b'shvil tinokot kedei shelo yishnu. On Erev Pesach, for the children so that they wouldn't sleep. So you make the children leave the Beit Midrash so they can go home and nap. Good luck with that. I'm very pleased that my days of trying to force people to nap in a busy household are over. The Erev Yom Kippurim, kedei Yachilu et b'neihem, and on Erev Yom Kippur, he's throwing out the adult students to send them home to feed their children before Yom Kippur. Tana Rabbanan, Chayav Adam l'sameach banav uvnei veito b'rega. The Braita says a person is obligated to cause joy for his sons and his children and his household members on the holiday. As it says, V'samachta b'chagecha. right? And they're reading v'samachta not as you will rejoice, but as you will induce rejoicing in other people on your holiday. Misamchan. So how do you make other people happy? B'yayin. The Breita's initial suggestion is you do this by getting them drunk, which is probably why this is quoted here, because we were a few minutes ago talking about whether there was any point in giving children alcohol, and here Rabbi Yehuda, same person who said that was dumb, pops up with, well, you need to give people things that make those particular people happy. So Rabbi Yehuda says, Anashim b'ra'ui lahem, v'nashim b'ra'ui lahem. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you give men what men like, you give women what women like. Anashim b'ra'ui lahem b'yayin. So now this is the Gemara trying to understand Rabbi Yehuda. They say, okay, I understand from the context that men like wine, so you should give them wine. But nashim b'mai, what do you give women to make them happy? Tani Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef taught, B'Bavel bigdei tzivonim, be'Eretz Yisrael bigdei pishtan megohatzim. So in Babylonia, the women like colored clothing. In Israel, the cool, new, expensive, fashionable thing is freshly pressed linen clothing. But either way, it seems to be culturally dependent in whatever it is that these particular people want, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And that, I believe, that is the position that we follow, that everybody enjoys Yom Tov with whatever it is that makes them personally happy. Although the primary purpose of the mitzvah seems to be giving other people what would make the other person happy. Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer, Bizman shebeit hamikdash kayam ein simcha el b'basar. Shne'emar v'zavachta shlamim ve'achalta sham v'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera wants a textually based sense of what makes people happy, or at least what constitutes religious celebration. So he says, when the temple is standing, simcha means meat. Like it says, and your shlamim are the kind of sacrifice that the owner gets to eat, and then you'll eat it there, and you'll rejoice in front of Hashem. So this pasuk does seem to say that when you celebrate in front of God on a holiday, you're supposed to have a dead animal in front of you that was sacrificed. But he says now that the temple is destroyed and we can't presumably eat sacrificial meat, he doesn't really see any point in eating meat anymore. So now all that's left is wine. Because the pasuk in Tehillim says, but wine pleases the heart, or rejoices the heart of man. So that seems to be, on the one hand, a bit of a lament for the lost meat. On the other hand, that he feels like all that's left is the wine. I still don't see him giving it to the small children. That really does seem pointless. I think Rabbi Yehuda has a very strong point on that one. But to the extent that somebody enjoys drinking wine, it does seem like there's a strong association between that and the mitzvah of V'samachta b'chagecha, although I do want one more time to stress that it sounds here like the primary point of the mitzvah of rejoicing is that those people who are financially dependent on you, or dependent on you to be able to get stuff, that you give them things that make them happy. That actually seems to be the main purpose of this mitzvah, is that you use your stuff to induce joy in other people, especially the people you're responsible for. All right, that is the end for this evening. I'm sorry we went a little bit longer than we're supposed to. Are there questions? Okay, well, we had a lot of discussion during. I have a question for you guys. 2 weeks from tonight is the Monday before Pesach. I am happy to have a shiur. It's going to be material that's connected to the Seder. It seems appropriate and relevant, but I don't see the point if it's going to stress people out having to stop preparations in order to come, or if people don't have time and aren't going to come. What do you guys think?
We'll be there.
Okay.
I would definitely be there,
Okay.
I would also.
as long as it's okay with you.
I think so.
Okay.
Let me finish making my spreadsheet of what I need to do at which minute for that whole week.
You can
I
al-
think so. As of
You can
now.
always get a waiter, right? I should tell you.
Oh, yeah, a vaccinated one.
You know, the one thing I didn't ask at the time, but what if the waiter is a woman? Does the waiter still have to lean?
So it seems to be very unlikely that a waiter is someone who could be described as important. So my bet would be that a female servant, we could all agree, possibly even in more modern times when we claim all of our women are important, is probably in that moment, in that context, not important. But
Well,
I
maybe
see
at
any
young
reason
Israel
not to
of
give
Lake
people
Wobegon.
dignity. What?
Maybe at young Israel of Lake Wobegon.
Where everybody's above average, I suppose. The truth is that to the extent that it gives people dignity to be considered important enough to recline, I'm happy to share. Let's give everybody dignity. We will see as we continue through this chapter that it is not necessarily the case that the Gemara assumes that social stratification goes away just because you're celebrating freedom. And it's a little depressing, actually. But to the extent that we can control it in our own dining rooms, I think we should give everybody dignity in adulthood. Anyway, okay, so we'll be on for next week and the week after. The week after that is Yom Tov, so we will be off. And I will see you all next Monday. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.